The pervasive sensation that something is fundamentally off is not a philosophical mood. It is not a fleeting wave of modern ennui. It is not a personal psychological failing. It is a mass-scale, undiagnosed neurological injury. You are not simply depressed. You are suffering from severe cognitive and emotional overprocessing. Your biological hardware is actively rejecting the operating system of the modern world. Your nervous system is constantly bombarded by stimuli it was never evolved to handle. A brain attempts to process infinite data streams through a finite biological processor. This forces the neural pathways into a constant state of hyper-arousal. Your central nervous system begins to interpret mere existence as a high-threat environment. Watch closely how they react. An individual arrives home from work. They park their car in the driveway. They turn off the engine. They do not exit the vehicle. For 14 minutes, they sit in total silence. Their face is illuminated only by the harsh glare of a smartphone screen. They scroll through a short video feed. Their eyes track upward exactly every 3 seconds. Their thumb swipes automatically. Their facial muscles are entirely slack. They are not smiling. They are not laughing. They are not visibly processing the content in front of them. A family member walks down the driveway. They approach the vehicle and gently tap on the car window. The individual's immediate physical reaction is violent. There is a sharp, audible intake of breath. Their shoulders suddenly flinch upward toward their ears. The muscles along their jawline tighten instantly. They force a neutral greeting out of their mouth. But here is the brutal physical reality. Their pupils are massively dilated. Their resting heart rate has spiked to a stress response level. Why does the simple transition from digital isolation to basic human interaction trigger an alarm? Why does a perfectly safe environment provoke an involuntary biological threat response? In the central nervous system, the systematic elimination of dead time is not a productivity hack. It is a structural assault on your neurology. We have completely eradicated unstructured silence from the human experience. We have successfully pathologized basic boredom. This constant intake destroys the brain's ability to consolidate memory. It dismantles the biological mechanism required to regulate your emotional baseline. The capacity for deep, critical self-reflection is entirely gone. Your brain is no longer an active processor. It is merely a passive receiver of endless noise. The actual fatal mechanism is the death of the refractory period. This is the biological collapse of the default mode network. The human brain absolutely requires periods of low stimulus wakefulness. This silence is mandatory to activate the default mode network. This specific neural network is responsible for constructing your autobiographical memory. Unresolved emotional states. By constantly flooding your optical nerves with bite-sized content, you block this process entirely. You force the brain into a perpetual state of task. Positive network activation. Your brain is locked in an aggressive processing mode forever. Physiologically, this sustained dominance has brutal consequences. It physically prevents the brain from clearing metabolic waste. Neurotoxins literally build up inside the skull. This creates an unnatural, highly toxic accumulation of cortisol and glutamate. This specific chemical flood triggers allostatic overload. Your neuroendocrine system literally exhausts itself. It burns out trying to re-establish a biological baseline. But that baseline homeostasis no longer exists. Watch closely how they react. A person stands entirely alone in a steel elevator. It is a 12-second ride down to the lobby. The metal doors have not even fully closed yet. Their right hand automatically reaches into their pocket. The muscle memory entirely bypasses conscious thought. They retrieve their smartphone and unlock the screen. They immediately open an email application. They stare directly at a promotional email. Their eyes do not scan the text from left to right. There is no actual reading taking place. The illuminated screen merely serves as a visual pacifier. The elevator chimes for the lobby. They instantly lock the screen. They shove the device back into their pocket and walk out. They did not register a single detail of their physical environment, and it gets worse. This results in the absolute atrophy of deep contemplation. The default mode network is never allowed to run its integration phase. Your daily experiences are merely recorded as raw, fragmented data. They are never converted into meaningful memory. They are never synthesized into emotional wisdom. Your life becomes a high-speed blur of disconnected inputs. This manifests as a very specific clinical presentation. You experience chronic fatigue entirely devoid of physical exertion. Your muscles are rested, yet your central nervous system is completely decimated. You feel entirely exhausted while having achieved absolutely nothing of substance. This chronic cognitive suffocation does not stop there. It doesn't merely erase our internal memories. It forces our entire nervous system to physically mutate. It permanently alters how your biology perceives the external world. It turns your immediate physical environment into a relentless predator. The modern mandate for constant accessibility is not a cultural shift. It is a forced biological rewiring. The expectation of an instantaneous response has hijacked your central nervous system. It has forcibly dragged your physiological baseline away from its natural state. Your body is no longer allowed to enter the parasympathetic rest and digest phase. Instead, you are trapped in a chronic, low-grade sympathetic nervous system loop. You are perpetually suspended in a state of fight or flight. The actual fatal mechanism is societal-level vagal tone degradation. Your phone delivers unpredictable, intermittent reinforcement through digital notifications. To your primal brain, this erratic signaling perfectly mimics evolutionary threat markers. It is biologically identical to a rustling bush indicating a hidden predator. This relentless, unpredictable stimulation keeps the amygdala in a state of chronic hyper-arousal. The amygdala is the brain's primary threat detection center. It is constantly sounding a biological false alarm. Over time, this chronic stress physically degrades the Ventral Vagal Complex. This neural complex is your absolute biological pacemaker. It is directly responsible for signaling social safety and actively calming the heart rate. When this vital vagal tone drops, structural failure occurs in the brain. The prefrontal cortex completely loses its top-down inhibitory control over the amygdala. The biological braking system on your anxiety is physically severed. Your brain becomes literally incapable of down-regulating fear. It loses the mechanical ability to process environmental safety. You begin to interpret benign silence as a precursor to an attack. You perceive slow-paced environments as dangerously unpredictable. Your nervous system treats a quiet room as a tactical blind spot. Watch closely how they react. Two friends are sitting at a small table inside a quiet cafe. One person's smartphone is placed face-up on the wooden surface. During an active conversation, the glass screen lights up entirely silently. It is a standard push notification. The person is speaking mid-sentence. They instantly break direct eye contact with their friend. Their pupils snap downward to scan the illuminated text. They entirely lose their train of thought for precisely 1.5 seconds. Their vocal cords stall. They blink rapidly and say, "Wait, what was I saying?" But watch the physical geometry of their body. They physically lean backward in their chair. They pull their elbows tightly inward toward their ribs. They immediately cross their arms over their chest. Their physical posture has completely shifted. They went from an open, forward, leaning posture of social engagement to total defensive withdrawal. They are physically bracing for an incoming kinetic strike. This severe biological defense mechanism was triggered by a silent screen. It was a notification for a localized weather update. But here is the brutal physical reality. This creates the biological impossibility of intimacy. True human vulnerability is a highly sensitive physiological state. Deep connection strictly requires a heavily down-regulated nervous system. Your body must register absolute safety to open the neural gates of empathy. But your physical frame is currently braced for impact. Your muscles are involuntarily tensed in anticipation of the next micro-demand. Your brain is continuously scanning for the next digital alert. Under these strict physiological conditions, deep emotional resonance cannot be accessed. The biological hardware simply refuses to run the software of connection. As our biology violently rejects genuine vulnerability, the system demands a substitute. We begin to manufacture artificial, low-calorie coping mechanisms. We attempt to mechanically mimic real social connection. This desperate biological pivot leads directly to the absolute starvation of the human social brain. We have systematically eradicated the biological process of building human trust. True interpersonal trust requires a high-friction, slow-burn neurochemical exchange. It demands physical presence and massive cognitive caloric expenditure. We have entirely replaced this grueling biological imperative. We substitute it with low-friction, high-dopamine synthetic interactions. These digital exchanges manufacture a flawless illusion of connection, but they deliver absolutely zero physiological payoff to the nervous system. The actual fatal mechanism is the absolute disruption of social baseline theory. Human brains do not regulate their metabolic energy in isolation. They are strictly designed to co-regulate with other biological organisms. Sharing physical proximity actively alters your neurochemistry. Sustained eye contact literally reduces the brain's baseline energy expenditure. It signals the amygdala to stop relentlessly assessing the environment for threats. Your nervous system literally offloads its defensive burden onto the social group. Digital communication violently hijacks this ancient biological architecture. It bypasses the social circuitry and directly attacks the dopaminergic system. Receiving a text message triggers an immediate neurochemical spike. The notification exploits the brain's reward prediction error mechanism. You get a rapid synthetic hit of dopamine without executing any biological work. But here is the brutal physical reality. This synthetic digital interaction severely lacks a critical neurochemical payload. It totally fails to trigger the release of oxytocin. It entirely bypasses the production of endogenous opioids. These specific bonding chemicals cannot be transmitted through a screen. They strictly require the physical proximity of another human body. They demand the active auditory processing of vocal prosody. They only activate through the exact, real-time synchrony of facial micro-expressions. The biological bond simply does not form. Watch closely how they react. A person is sitting alone on their living room couch. Their phone vibrates with a long, dense text message. It is from a close friend detailing a severe, active personal crisis. The person's eyes scan the illuminated text rapidly. Their thumbs immediately strike the glass keyboard. They type, "IMG, I am so sorry." They type, "I am here for you, sending so many hugs." They manually select exactly 3 crying face emojis. Observe their physical reality during this entire 15-second exchange. Their facial expression remains entirely flat and paralyzed. There is absolutely zero micro-movement in their brow or jawline. Their baseline respiratory rate remains completely unchanged. Their heart rate does not elevate to mirror their friend's distress. Their thumb presses the send arrow. Less than a quarter of a second later, their thumb swipes upward. They instantly close the messaging application. They immediately open a food delivery platform to browse local restaurants. And it gets worse. This behavior guarantees the absolute starvation of the human social neurocircuitry. We are flooding our brains with inputs that lack actual biological sustenance. We engineer a massive neurochemical discrepancy within our own skulls. We maintain dangerously high levels of digital dopaminergic engagement. Simultaneously, we endure a fatal deficit of biochemical social reward. This creates a profound clinical psychological famine. You feel intensely isolated in the modern world. This is not because you are failing to communicate with others. It is because your physical body refuses to register the communication as real. The nervous system recognizes the digital text as dead, synthetic data. When our primary method of daily connection systematically starves our biology, structural collapse follows. Our baseline tolerance for the heavy, necessary burdens of real human relationships completely evaporates. We relentlessly engineer physical friction out of our daily existence. We aggressively label this total eradication as lifestyle optimization. We methodically remove cognitive resistance from our daily routines. We systematically strip away the basic friction of social interaction. We falsely believe we are streamlining our biological hardware, but here is the brutal physical reality. We have inadvertently destroyed our baseline psychological resilience. We have dismantled our fundamental biological capacity to navigate complexity. We can no longer sustain long-term human dynamics. The actual fatal mechanism is mass prefrontal cortex thinning. This severe structural degradation is driven by radically altered operant conditioning. The modern technological environment operates entirely on continuous reinforcement schedules. Your daily existence is saturated with instant food delivery. You are fed continuous, frictionless algorithmic curation. These immediate digital rewards entirely bypass the brain's delay, discounting mechanisms. Your neural architecture is simply no longer forced to wait for a dopaminergic payload. The prefrontal cortex is directly responsible for your high-level executive function. It houses the primary biological circuits for basic impulse control. It serves as the main engine for all emotional regulation. These critical neural pathways absolutely require cognitive resistance training. They must endure the biological friction of delayed gratification to remain robust. They physically demand the active strain of real-time problem solving. Without this mandatory daily friction, these neural pathways physically atrophy. The biological tissue literally loses its structural density. Your biological distress tolerance window rapidly shrinks. It collapses down to a baseline of near absolute zero. Watch closely how they react. A couple stands face to face in their own kitchen. They are verbally discussing logistical plans for the upcoming weekend. The conversation hits a remarkably minor point of interpersonal friction. It is a basic disagreement regarding their exact departure time. Precisely 30 seconds of this mild resistance transpire. One partner inhales deeply and exhales sharply through their nasal cavity. Their right hand immediately reaches downward into their pocket. They extract their smartphone and illuminate the glass screen. They state flatly, "You know what, whatever you want is fine. Just let me know." Their right thumb immediately begins a repetitive vertical scrolling motion. Observe the precise physical geometry of their body. They physically pivot both feet on the kitchen floor. They rotate their shoulders exactly 45 degrees away from their partner. They completely sever the physical axis of social engagement. They actively choose immediate digital pacification. Their central nervous system cannot biologically endure a simple 3-minute verbal negotiation. They physically flee from the most microscopic interpersonal friction, and it gets worse. This biological collapse dictates the systemic fragility of modern human relationships. There is an exact moment when a social dynamic requires active effort. A situation demands basic interpersonal patience or mild psychological discomfort. The modern, atrophied brain completely misinterprets this incoming data. It processes this entirely normal, healthy friction as a catastrophic systemic failure. The nervous system registers a mild disagreement as a severe, active biological threat. The amygdala immediately triggers a total physiological abort protocol. The individual abruptly severs the human connection to neutralize the perceived danger. This exact neurological failure drives a massive culture of entirely disposable relationships. It locks the human population into a permanent state of chronic avoidance. The pervasive feeling that society is breaking down is a complete optical illusion. Society is not actively breaking down around you. It has already been fundamentally and irreversibly rewired. Your chronic discomfort is merely the physical symptom of this radioactive fallout. A hollow ache you feel in your chest is not simple nostalgia. It is the violent alarm bell of your own biological software. Your nervous system is actively rejecting a fundamentally hostile operating environment. We are absolutely not adapting to a highly advanced future. We are physically mutating into hyper-vigilant nodes of consumption. We are becoming emotionally atrophied biological terminals. To sit quietly and wait for the external world to slow down is a fatal miscalculation. The world will never heal itself. The external velocity of the system will only accelerate. But here is the brutal physical reality. You must ruthlessly force physical friction back into your daily existence. You must forcefully inject raw biological presence back into your immediate reality. This is absolutely not a temporary digital detox. This is mandatory neurological physical therapy. Your brain requires aggressive rehabilitation to survive. You must immediately execute strict biological boundaries. You must leave your mobile device in a physically separate room during every single meal. Do not simply place it face down on the dining table. Remove the device entirely from your physical line of sight. You will immediately feel a sharp, visceral spike of withdrawal anxiety. Your heart rate will actively elevate as the dopamine deficit hits your bloodstream. You must forcefully compel your brain to endure this exact physiological panic. You must sit still and wait out the chemical storm in real time. You must hold your physical position until your prefrontal cortex regains baseline control. You must also execute tactical pauses during all face-to-face human interactions. When another person is speaking directly to you, maintain absolute unbroken eye contact. Do not let your pupils dart to the periphery of the room. When they finish speaking, intentionally delay your verbal response. Hold the total silence for exactly 2 full seconds. Endure the heavy, awkward physical weight of the dead air. Force your biological brain into a state of active, rigorous, cognitive processing. Stop relying on the reactive, algorithmic scripting of modern conversational reflexes. Finally, you must actively practice enduring the void. You must walk into a room with absolutely zero auditory or visual inputs. Sit up straight in a chair for exactly 10 minutes every single day. Do not close your eyes to meditate. Do not attempt to artificially calm your respiratory rate. Simply observe the chaotic, violent withdrawal symptoms of your own nervous system. Feel the exact physical location of the panic blooming in your torso. You must repeatedly reacclimate your biology to absolute, unbroken silence. You must drill this physical exposure until quiet no longer registers as a kinetic threat. The system thrives entirely on your chronic hypervigilance. The machine physically feeds on your profound neurochemical exhaustion. It will never organically grant you the permission to pause. You must physically become the friction that slows the mechanism down. If you are ready to stop functioning as a highly responsive algorithm, if you are ready to start operating as a conscious biological human being, subscribe to this channel. We surgically dissect the brutal physical realities here, piece by piece. Stay vigilant.